The question hit him like a slap across the face at 11:47 p.m., right as the last guest was walking out the door. Wilson stood in the kitchen, mechanically loading wine glasses into the dishwasher when Sarah's voice cut through the silence behind him. Her birthday dress still perfect, makeup still flawless, but her tone had that edge he'd been hearing more and more lately. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. "Why are you so quiet?" she asked, leaning against the doorframe with her arms crossed. The same pose she struck when she was about to pick a fight. Wilson paused, a champagne flute halfway to the top rack. He'd been quiet because he'd spent the entire evening watching his girlfriend of 3 years laugh at Marcus's jokes, touch his arm during stories, and act like Wilson was just another guest at her party. Marcus, her ex-boyfriend of 2 years who somehow managed to secure a prime spot at her birthday celebration, while Wilson got introduced as "my boyfriend" only when people specifically asked. He turned around slowly, setting the glass down with deliberate care. "Why did you invite your ex?" The words hung in the air like smoke from a blown-out candle. Sarah's expression shifted from confrontational to defensive in the span of a heartbeat. "Marcus and I are friends now. We've been over for years. You're being paranoid." Wilson wiped his hands on the dish towel, his movements calm despite the storm brewing in his chest. Friends don't lean into each other during group photos. Friends don't share inside jokes that make everyone else feel like they're watching a private conversation. "Oh my God, Wilson, it's my birthday. I wanted people I care about to be there." "People you care about," he repeated the phrase like he was testing it for flavor. "Where exactly do I rank on that list?" Wilson Arab had always prided himself on being reasonable. At 32, he managed logistics for a construction company, owned his apartment outright, and maintained friendships that went back to college. He wasn't the type to create drama or issue ultimatums. But standing in Sarah's kitchen at midnight, surrounded by the remnants of a birthday party where he'd felt like a stranger, something shifted. The evening had started normally enough. Wilson had taken the afternoon off to help Sarah set up her apartment for the party. He moved furniture, arranged flowers, and made sure the bar cart was properly stocked. Sarah had been buzzing with excitement, flitting around in her robe while she got ready, occasionally stopping to kiss his cheek and tell her how much she loved him. "This is going to be perfect," she'd said, applying mascara in the bathroom mirror while Wilson adjusted the living room lighting. "All my favorite people in one place." He'd smiled at her reflection, genuinely happy to see her so animated. Sarah worked long hours as a marketing director, and her genuine joy was something he'd been seeing less of lately. If throwing a party made her this happy, he was all in. The first guests had arrived at 7. Sarah's college roommates, her work friends, a few neighbors from her building. Wilson knew most of them and settled into his usual role as the supportive boyfriend, making sure drinks stayed full and conversations kept flowing. He was good at parties, even when they weren't his own. Then Marcus walked in. Wilson had heard about Marcus, of course, 2-year relationship that ended amicably about 6 months before Wilson and Sarah got together. Sarah occasionally mentioned him in passing, usually in the context of funny stories from their college days or mutual friends who still hung out with both of them. Wilson had never felt threatened because Sarah never gave him reason to. But watching Marcus walk into the party like he owned the place, seeing Sarah's face light up in a way that Wilson hadn't witnessed in months, feeling the subtle shift in room dynamics as other guests gravitated toward Marcus's larger-than-life personality, that was different. Marcus was everything Wilson wasn't. Tall where Wilson was average height, loud where Wilson was thoughtful, commanding attention where Wilson preferred to observe. He worked in entertainment, had stories about celebrities, and possessed the kind of charisma that made even strangers feel like his best friend within minutes. "Marcus!" Sarah had practically squealed, abandoning the conversation she'd been having with her coworker to rush toward the door. She'd hugged him longer than she'd hugged anyone else that night, and Wilson noticed how her hands lingered on his shoulders when they pulled apart. "Birthday girl," Marcus had said in that smooth voice of his, producing a wrapped gift that was clearly expensive and beautifully presented. "You look incredible." Wilson had been standing near the kitchen, holding a bottle of wine and watching this interaction unfold. Sarah glanced his way briefly, a flash of guilt, embarrassment, crossing her features before she turned back to Marcus. "Everyone, this is Marcus," she announced to the room, her arm still linked through his. "We go way back." No mention of their romantic history, no acknowledgement that this was potentially awkward. Just, "We go way back," like Wilson was supposed to understand what that meant and be comfortable with it. The party had continued, but Wilson found himself paying attention to things he normally wouldn't notice. How Sarah's laugh got higher and more frequent when Marcus was telling stories. How she touched his arm during conversations, something she used to do with Wilson but hadn't in weeks. How she seemed to position herself in Marcus's orbit, even when she was talking to other people. Wilson tried to integrate himself into the dynamic. He'd approach groups where Sarah and Marcus were holding court, contribute to conversations, make his presence known. But there was something about their chemistry that made everyone else feel like supporting characters in their show. "Remember that time in Cabo when you convinced the bartender to let us behind the bar?" Marcus had said during one story, and Sarah had dissolved into giggles. "You were so smooth. I can't believe he fell for that accent you were doing." "What accent?" Wilson had asked, genuinely trying to participate. Sarah and Marcus had shared a look, one of those wordless communications that couples develop over time, before Marcus launched into an impression that had the whole group laughing. Everyone except Wilson, who realized he was watching his girlfriend reminisce about a romantic vacation with another man at her own birthday party. The worst part was how natural it all seemed. Sarah wasn't flirting exactly. She wasn't doing anything that Wilson could point to and call inappropriate. But the ease between them, the shared history, the way they seemed to communicate in shorthand that excluded everyone else, it made Wilson feel invisible in his own relationship. He'd retreated to the kitchen under the pretense of managing food and drinks, needing space to process what he was feeling. This wasn't jealousy in the traditional sense. Wilson wasn't worried that Sarah was going to run off with Marcus tonight, but watching them together forced him to confront something he'd been avoiding for months. When was the last time Sarah had looked at him the way she'd been looking at Marcus all evening? When was the last time she'd touched his arm during a story or laughed at his jokes with that kind of genuine delight? When was the last time she'd seemed genuinely excited to see him walk through a door? Wilson had been making excuses for months. Sarah was stressed at work. They'd been together long enough that the honeymoon phase was naturally ending. They were both busy adults with demanding careers. These were normal relationship progressions that every couple experienced. But seeing her with Marcus illuminated the difference between going through the motions and actually being excited about someone. The contrast was stark enough to make Wilson question everything. He'd spent the rest of the party observing from the margins, watching Sarah navigate between her guests but always returning to Marcus's gravitational pull. She was the hostess, gracious and attentive to everyone, but there was an energy around Marcus that didn't exist with anyone else. When people started taking group photos, Sarah had naturally positioned herself next to Marcus. When someone suggested a toast, Marcus had been the one to raise his glass first, speaking eloquently about Sarah's kindness and beauty while Wilson stood in the background holding his wine and wondering why he felt like a guest at his own girlfriend's birthday party. The evening had worn on with Wilson becoming increasingly aware of his own irrelevance. Conversations flowed around him. Sarah checked in occasionally, squeezing his shoulder or asking if he needed anything, but her attention always returned to Marcus and the stories that Wilson wasn't part of. By the time the last guest was saying goodbye, Wilson felt hollowed out. He'd hosted dozens of parties with Sarah, had been her partner in social situations for 3 years, but tonight he'd felt more like hired help than her boyfriend. Sarah had been in full hostess mode during the goodbyes, hugging everyone and promising to make plans soon. Marcus had been among the last to leave, and Wilson had watched from the kitchen as Sarah walked him to the door. "Thank you for coming," she'd said, and Wilson could hear the genuine warmth in her voice. "It means so much that you were here." "Wouldn't miss it," Marcus had replied. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. There had been a moment, just a few seconds, where they'd stood in the doorway together, and Wilson had seen something pass between them. Not romantic necessarily, but intimate in a way that made Wilson feel like an intruder in his own girlfriend's home. After Marcus left, Sarah had kicked off her heels and started collecting empty glasses, chattering about what a great party it had been and how happy she was that everyone could make it. She'd been energized in a way that Wilson hadn't seen in months, practically glowing with satisfaction. Wilson had started loading the dishwasher, processing the evening, and trying to understand what he was feeling. It wasn't anger, exactly. It wasn't even jealousy in the way he'd expected jealousy to feel. It was something closer to recognition, the uncomfortable realization that he'd been settling for a version of his relationship that wasn't sustainable. The apartment had grown quiet as they cleaned up, both of them moving efficiently through the familiar routine of post-party cleanup. Sarah had been humming under her breath, still riding the high of a successful evening, while Wilson had been sinking deeper into contemplation. That's when she'd asked why he was so quiet. That's when 3 years of unexamined relationship dynamics had crystallized into a single moment of clarity. "Friends don't lean into each other during group photos," he'd said, and he could see in Sarah's expression that she knew exactly what he was talking about. "Friends don't share inside jokes that make everyone else feel like they're watching a private conversation." Sarah had set down the glass she'd been holding and turned to face him fully. "Wilson, you're reading too much into this. Marcus and I have history, yes, but it's ancient history. We're different people now." "Are you?" Wilson asked. "Because watching you tonight, you seemed more like yourself than you've been in months. More animated, more engaged, more alive than I've seen you in I don't know how long." The words had come out more honestly than he'd intended, and he could see Sarah processing them, her defensive posture shifting slightly. "That's not fair," she'd said, but her voice had lost some of its edge. "I was excited about my party. I was happy to see friends I haven't seen in a while." "When was the last time you were that excited to see me?" Wilson asked. "When was the last time you laughed at something I said the way you were laughing at his stories tonight?" Sarah had opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again. The silence that followed was answer enough. Wilson had continued loading the dishwasher, giving them both time to sit with what he'd just said. He wasn't trying to hurt her or start a fight. He was trying to understand when their relationship had become something they were both just going through the motions of. "I love you," Sarah had said finally, and Wilson could hear the sincerity in her voice. "I love you too," Wilson had replied. "But love isn't the same thing as being excited about someone, and watching you tonight made me realize how long it's been since we've been excited about each other." Sarah had leaned against the counter, her party dress suddenly looking less celebratory and more like a costume she was ready to take off. "So what are you saying?" she'd asked. "That you're jealous of Marcus?" Wilson had considered the question seriously before answering. "I'm not jealous of Marcus. I'm envious of the version of you that shows up when he's around. I want to be with someone who lights up when I walk into a room, not someone who treats me like a reliable piece of furniture." The comparison had been harsher than he'd intended, but it wasn't inaccurate. Over the past few months, Wilson had felt increasingly like a comfortable fixture in Sarah's life, rather than someone she was actively choosing to be with. Sarah had stared at him for a long moment, and Wilson could see her cycling through different responses: defensive anger, guilty recognition, confused hurt. She'd settled on something that sounded like a cross between all three. "I don't treat you like furniture," she'd said. "We live separate lives. We have our own friends, our own interests. That's healthy." "Having separate lives is healthy," Wilson had agreed. "Feeling like strangers when we're in the same room isn't." Sarah had looked around the kitchen, taking in the remnants of her birthday party, and Wilson could see her trying to reconcile her evening of happiness with this conversation about their relationship's shortcomings. "I don't know what you want me to say," she'd finally said. "I can't change the fact that Marcus and I have history. I can't pretend I don't enjoy catching up with old friends. I'm not asking you to pretend anything, Wilson had replied. I'm asking you to be honest about what this relationship actually is right now. The question had hung between them like a challenge neither of them was ready to fully engage with. Wilson had finished loading the dishwasher and started wiping down counters, using the familiar motions to buy himself time to think. Sarah had remained leaning against the counter, watching him clean and processing whatever she was processing. The energy that had been sustaining her throughout the party had finally started to ebb, and Wilson could see exhaustion creeping in around the edges. "Can we not do this tonight?" she'd asked eventually. "It's late, I'm tired, and I just want to enjoy what was a really good birthday." Wilson had paused in his cleaning, recognizing the request for what it was. Not a postponement, but an avoidance. Sarah was asking him to pretend this conversation hadn't happened, to go back to the comfortable routine of not examining what they'd become. "When would be a good time?" he'd ask. "When would you want to talk about the fact that we're not happy?" Sarah had flinched at the word happy like it had physically struck her. "I am happy," she'd said, but the words had sounded automatic rather than genuine. Wilson had folded the dish towel carefully, taking time to get the corners aligned just right. It was a small task, but it gave him something to focus on while he figured out how to respond. "Okay," he'd said finally. "If you're happy, then we don't need to talk about it." Sarah had looked at him suspiciously, clearly expecting more pushback. "But I'm not happy," Wilson had continued, "and I'm not going to keep pretending that I am just to avoid difficult conversations." The words had felt significant as soon as they left his mouth, not because they were dramatic or ultimatum-like, but because they were the first completely honest thing he'd said about their relationship in months. Sarah had stared at him, and Wilson could see her trying to decide whether this was a fight she wanted to solve. "What does that mean?" she'd asked. Wilson had hung the dish towel on its hook and turned to face him fully. "It means I'm going to start being honest about what I need instead of pretending I don't need anything," he'd said. "And I'm going to start making decisions based on what actually makes me happy instead of what's comfortable or convenient." Sarah had processed this for a moment, clearly trying to determine whether Wilson was threatening to leave or just asking for more attention. "And if I can't give you what you need?" she'd asked. Wilson had considered the question seriously before answering. "Then we'll both know where we stand," he said, "and we can make decisions from there." The conversation had ended there, not with resolution, but with recognition. They'd finished cleaning up in relative silence, both of them processing what had been said and what it meant for what came next. Wilson had gone to bed that night knowing that something fundamental had shifted, not just in his relationship with Sarah, but in his relationship with himself. For months, he'd been accommodating and understanding and patient, telling himself that these were virtues in a long-term relationship. But watching Sarah with Marcus had forced him to confront her uncomfortable truth. He'd been settling for scraps of attention from someone who was capable of much more engagement when she wanted to give it. He'd been accepting a diminished version of partnership because it was easier than acknowledging that they might not be right for each other anymore. The birthday party hadn't been the problem. It had been the revelation. And now that Wilson had seen the contrast clearly, he couldn't unsee it. As he'd lain in bed that night, listening to Sarah's breathing beside him, Wilson had realized that asking, "Why did you invite your ex?" had been the wrong question. The right question was, "Why don't you look at me the way you look at him?" And the answer to that question was going to determine everything that happened next. The next morning arrived with the kind of gray Seattle drizzle that made everything feel muted and uncertain. Wilson woke before his alarm, Sarah still sleeping beside him, her makeup from the night before smudged across the pillowcase. He slipped out of bed quietly and made coffee in the kitchen where just hours earlier he'd had his moment of clarity. The apartment still smelled faintly of birthday cake and expensive perfume. Sarah's presents sat stacked on the dining table, including Marcus's elaborately wrapped gift that remained unopened. Wilson stared at it while sipping his coffee, remembering how Sarah had set it aside with a smile that suggested she was saving the best for last. When Sarah finally emerged from the bedroom an hour later, she looked like someone recovering from more than just a late night. Her hair was disheveled, her eyes puffy, and she moved with the careful deliberation of someone trying to avoid a conversation they weren't ready to have. "Good morning," Wilson said, his voice neutral but not cold. "Morning," Sarah replied, heading straight for the coffee maker without making eye contact. "Thanks for cleaning up last night. I would have helped more, but I was exhausted." Wilson watched her pour coffee into her favorite mug, the one he'd bought her from a pottery studio in Portland during their second year together. She doctored it with cream and sugar, a routine he'd witnessed hundreds of times, but today it felt like watching a stranger perform familiar motions. "We should talk," Wilson said, simply. Sarah's shoulders tensed, but she kept her back to him, stirring her coffee with unnecessary precision. "About what?" "About what I said last night. About what happens next." Sarah turned around, leaning against the counter in a defensive posture that had become her default during difficult conversations. "Wilson, I was thinking about that, and I think you were just tired and maybe a little overwhelmed by the party. You're not usually the jealous type." Wilson sat down his mug with deliberate care. This was it, the moment when Sarah would either engage honestly with what he'd said or try to minimize it away. Her choice would tell him everything he needed to know about what she was willing to do to save their relationship. "I wasn't jealous," Wilson said. "I was seeing clearly for the first time in months." Sarah's expression shifted from hopeful to wary. "Seeing what clearly?" "That you're capable of being excited about someone, that you light up when the right person walks into a room, that you can be engaged and animated and genuinely delighted by another person's company." Wilson paused, letting the words settle. "And that none of those things happen when that person is me." Sarah opened her mouth to protest, but Wilson continued before she could interrupt. "I'm not asking you to defend yourself or explain it away," he said. "I'm telling you that I saw something last night that I can't unsee, and now I need to decide what to do with that information." Sarah stared at him, coffee mug forgotten in her hands. "What does that mean?" Wilson had spent most of the night thinking about this exact question. What did it mean? What was he prepared to do? What was he willing to accept, and what would he no longer tolerate? "It means I'm going to start acting like someone who deserves to be chosen, not just tolerated," Wilson said. "And I'm going to stop making excuses for being treated like an afterthought in my own relationship." Sarah set her mug on the counter with enough force to make the coffee slosh. "I don't treat you like an afterthought. That's not fair." "When was the last time you initiated physical affection?" Wilson asked. "When was the last time you suggested we do something together that wasn't a logistical necessity? When was the last time you asked me about my day because you were genuinely curious, not because you were going through the motions of being a good girlfriend?" Each question landed like a small stone thrown into still water, creating ripples that Sarah couldn't ignore. Wilson could see her cycling through potential answers and coming up short. "Relationships change," Sarah said. "The honeymoon phase doesn't last forever. We've been together 3 years. Of course things are different now." "Different doesn't have to mean distant," Wilson replied. "Comfortable doesn't have to mean disengaged." Sarah pushed away from the counter, pacing toward the living room where remnants of her party still lingered. A few stray napkins on the coffee table, a wine glass forgotten on the bookshelf, the faint impression in the couch cushions where people had been sitting just hours earlier. "So what do you want me to do?" Sarah asked, her voice taking on an edge of frustration. "Pretend to be someone I'm not? Force myself to be more affectionate? Put on a performance to make you feel better?" Wilson followed her into the living room, recognizing this tactic. When Sarah felt cornered, she had a tendency to reframe requests for authentic connection as demands for fake performance. It was a way of avoiding responsibility while making the other person seem unreasonable. "I don't want you to perform," Wilson said. "I want you to want to be affectionate. I want you to miss me when I'm not here. I want you to be curious about my thoughts and excited about my company." Wilson paused, letting the words settle. "And that none of those things happen when that person is me." Sarah opened her mouth to protest, but Wilson continued before she could interrupt. "I'm not asking you to defend yourself or explain it away," he said. "I'm telling you that I saw something last night that I can't unsee, and now I need to decide what to do with that information." Sarah stared at him, coffee mug forgotten in her hands. "What does that mean?" Wilson had spent most of the night thinking about this exact question. What did it mean? What was he prepared to do? What was he willing to accept, and what would he no longer tolerate? It means I'm going to start acting like someone who deserves to be chosen, not just tolerated, Wilson said. And I'm going to stop making excuses for being treated like an afterthought in my own relationship. Sarah set her mug on the counter with enough force to make the coffee slosh. I don't treat you like an afterthought. That's not fair. When was the last time you initiated physical affection? Wilson asked. When was the last time you suggested we do something together that wasn't a logistical necessity? When was the last time you asked me about my day because you were genuinely curious, not because you were going through the motions of being a good girlfriend? Each question landed like a small stone thrown into still water, creating ripples that Sarah couldn't ignore. Wilson could see her cycling through potential answers and coming up short. Relationships change, Sarah said. The honeymoon phase doesn't last forever. We've been together 3 years. Of course things are different now. Different doesn't have to mean distant, Wilson replied. Comfortable doesn't have to mean disengaged. Sarah pushed away from the counter, pacing toward the living room where remnants of her party still lingered. A few stray napkins on the coffee table, a wine glass forgotten on the bookshelf, the faint impression in the couch cushions where people had been sitting just hours earlier. "So what do you want me to do?" Sarah asked, her voice taking on an edge of frustration. Pretend to be someone I'm not? Force myself to be more affectionate? Put on a performance to make you feel better? Wilson followed her into the living room, recognizing this tactic. When Sarah felt cornered, she had a tendency to reframe requests for authentic connection as demands for fake performance. It was a way of avoiding responsibility while making the other person seem unreasonable. "I don't want you to perform," Wilson said. "I want you to want to be affectionate. I want you to miss me when I'm not here. I want you to be curious about my thoughts and excited about my company. And if I don't feel those things?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah had asked it defiantly, as if she expected Wilson to back down, to retreat into his usual pattern of accommodation and understanding. Instead, Wilson felt something click into place, a clarity he'd been missing for months. "Then we're not right for each other," he said. Sarah stared at him, clearly not expecting that response. "You're willing to throw away 3 years because I'm not sufficiently enthusiastic? I'm willing to stop pretending that settling for someone who finds me boring is the same thing as being loved." The word boring hit Sarah like a slap. She recoiled slightly, and Wilson could see that she was recognizing the truth in it. "I don't find you boring," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Sarah," Wilson said gently, "when was the last time you were excited to tell me something? When was the last time you heard my key in the door and felt happy instead of just neutral?" Sarah looked away, unable to meet his eyes. The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of unspoken acknowledgments. "Things have been stressful at work," Sarah said eventually. "I've been distracted. It's not personal." Wilson sat down on the counter, suddenly exhausted by the familiar rhythm of excuses and deflections. How many times had he accepted work stress as an explanation for emotional distance? How many times had he told himself that Sarah's disengagement was temporary, situational, fixable if he just waited long enough? "It's been 8 months," Wilson said. 8 months of you being distracted, stressed, tired, overwhelmed, or busy. 8 months of me being understanding and patient and accommodating. 8 months of me making excuses for why my girlfriend acts like spending time with me is a chore." Sarah sat down on the opposite end of the couch, maintaining physical distance that seemed to mirror their emotional gulf. "I'm sorry," she said, and Wilson could hear genuine regret in her voice. "I know I haven't been the best girlfriend lately. I know I've been distant, but that doesn't mean I don't love you." "Love isn't just a feeling," Wilson said. "It's a choice you make every day. It's deciding to prioritize someone, to engage with them, to show up for them, even when you don't feel like it. And you have been choosing not to do those things." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but Wilson couldn't tell if they were tears of genuine remorse or frustrated manipulation.
Sarah had always been able to cry on command when conversations weren't going her way. "What do you want?"
Tell me what to do, and I'll do it. This was the moment Wilson had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. Sarah was offering to try, to make an effort to change her behavior. 6 months ago, he would have leaped at this offer, grateful for any indication that she was willing to work on their relationship. But something had shifted in Wilson's understanding of what he deserved. Sarah's offer felt reactive rather than genuine, motivated by fear of consequences rather than authentic desire to reconnect. "I don't want you to do anything," Wilson said. "I want you to want to do things. I want you to choose me because being with me makes you happy, not because you're afraid of what happens if you don't." Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing the remnants of last night's mascara. "That's not fair. You're setting up an impossible standard. I can't control my feelings." "You're right," Wilson said. "You can't control your feelings, but you can be honest about what they are instead of pretending they're something else." Sarah looked at him with a mixture of confusion and growing alarm. "What are you saying?" Wilson stood up, walking to the window that overlooked the street where they'd lived parallel lives for the past year. His apartment was 3 blocks away, but he'd been spending most of his time here, gradually becoming more of a resident than a visitor. His toothbrush in her bathroom, his coffee in her cabinet, his books mixed with hers on the shelves. "I'm saying I'm going to start making decisions based on what I actually experience instead of what I hope will change," Wilson said. "And what I experience is a relationship with someone who tolerates my presence but isn't particularly excited about it." Sarah stood up as well, moving toward him with the urgency of someone trying to prevent a disaster. "Wilson, you're being dramatic. We're in a rough patch. All couples go through rough patches." "This isn't a rough patch," Wilson replied. "This is who we are together now. This is what our relationship has become when we're not actively trying to convince ourselves it's something else." Sarah reached for his hand, and Wilson let her take it, studying her face as she gripped his fingers with desperate intensity. "Please don't do this," Sarah said. "Please don't throw us away because I haven't been perfect lately." Wilson looked down at their joined hands, remembering when Sarah's touch used to send electricity through his system. Now it just felt like someone holding his hand because they thought they should. "I'm not throwing us away," Wilson said. "I'm refusing to cling to something that isn't working." Sarah's grip tightened. "It can work. I'll make it work. I'll try harder." "Sarah," Wilson said gently, "the fact that you have to try hard to enjoy being with me should tell us everything we need to know." Sarah released his hand as if it had burned her. "So that's it? You've made up your mind?" Wilson turned to face her fully. "I've decided to stop accepting less than I deserve. What that means for us depends on whether what I deserve is something you actually want to give." "And what do you think you deserve?" The question was asked with an edge of sarcasm that revealed more about Sarah's mindset than she probably intended. Wilson could hear the implication that his expectations were unreasonable, that he was being demanding, that he should be grateful for what he was getting. "I deserve to be with someone who's genuinely happy to see me," Wilson said. "Someone who initiates conversations because they're curious about my thoughts, not because silence is uncomfortable. Someone who touches me because they want to, not because it's expected. Someone who includes me in their life because they can't imagine it without me, not because it's convenient to have me around." Each item on Wilson's list felt like a small revolution. For months, he'd been telling himself that these expectations were unrealistic, that mature relationships didn't work this way, that he was being needy for wanting to feel wanted. But saying them out loud, Wilson realized that none of these things were unreasonable. They were the basic components of a romantic partnership between two people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. Sarah stared at him, and Wilson could see her processing the implications of what he'd said. If she agreed that these expectations were reasonable, she'd have to acknowledge that she wasn't meeting them. If she argued that they were unreasonable, she'd reveal how little she understood about what Wilson needed from their relationship.
Those things take time, Sarah said finally. Relationships ebb and flow. You can't expect constant romance and attention. I'm not asking for constant anything, Wilson replied. I'm asking for occasional evidence that you enjoy my company. Sarah's face flushed with what looked like shame mixed with defensiveness. I do enjoy your company. When? Wilson asked. Give me a specific example from the past month when you seemed genuinely happy to be spending time with me. Sarah opened her mouth, then closed it again. Wilson could see her searching her memory, trying to find an instance that would support her claim. We watched that documentary last weekend, Sarah said finally. You fell asleep 20 minutes in, Wilson replied, and you spent the first 20 minutes checking your phone. Sarah's flush deepened. I was tired. You're always tired when it comes to spending time with me, Wilson said, but you had plenty of energy for Marcus last night. The mention of Marcus changed the entire dynamic of the conversation. Sarah's expression shifted from defensive to angry. I knew this was really about Marcus, Sarah said. I knew you were jealous. This isn't about Marcus, Wilson said. Marcus just showed me what you look like when you're genuinely interested in someone, and it made me realize that you haven't looked at me that way in months. Sarah crossed her arms, her posture becoming rigid with defiance. So what? I'm supposed to pretend Marcus doesn't exist? Cut off all my friendships with men because my boyfriend is insecure? Wilson recognized this tactic as well. When Sarah couldn't defend her behavior, she escalated to accusations, trying to make Wilson's concerns seem unreasonable or controlling. I'm not asking you to cut off friendships, Wilson said calmly. I'm pointing out that you're capable of being engaged and excited about people. You just choose not to be engaged and excited about me. That's not a choice, Sarah snapped. That's not how feelings work. You're right, Wilson agreed. Feelings aren't a choice, but actions are, and your actions tell me everything I need to know about how you feel. Sarah began pacing again, her frustration evident in every movement. So what now? You're going to leave me because I'm not performing enthusiasm at the right level? Wilson watched her pace, noting how even in this moment of relationship crisis, Sarah was more animated than she'd been during most of their recent interactions. Conflict, it seemed, engaged her in a way that companionship didn't. I'm going to stop trying to convince you to want to be with me, Wilson said, and I'm going to start making decisions based on what actually is instead of what I hope might be, Wilson said. What does that mean practically? Wilson had been thinking about this question all morning. What would it look like to stop accommodating Sarah's disengagement? What boundaries could he set that would either inspire genuine change or provide clarity about their incompatibility?
It means I'm going to stop doing things that you take for granted, Wilson said. I'm going to stop initiating all our plans, stop carrying all our conversations, stop being available whenever it's convenient for you. You're going to punish me. I'm going to treat you the way you treat me, Wilson corrected, with polite distance and minimal investment. Sarah stared at him, clearly trying to process the implications of this shift. For 3 years, Wilson had been the pursuer in their relationship, the one who suggested activities, initiated physical affection, and worked to maintain emotional connection. If he stopped doing those things, what would be left? I'm going to treat you the way you treat me, Wilson corrected, with polite distance and minimal investment. Sarah stared at him, clearly trying to process the implications of this shift. For 3 years, Wilson had been the pursuer in their relationship, the one who suggested activities, initiated physical affection, and worked to maintain emotional connection. If he stopped doing those things, what would be left? I'm going to treat you the way you treat me, Wilson corrected, with polite distance and minimal investment. Sarah stared at him, clearly trying to process the implications of this shift. For 3 years, Wilson had been the pursuer in their relationship, the one who suggested activities, initiated physical affection, and worked to maintain emotional connection. If he stopped doing those things, what would be left? That's not how relationships work, Sarah said. Someone has to initiate things. You're right, Wilson agreed.
And from now on, that someone can be you. Sarah's expression shifted from angry to panicked. Wilson, you're being ridiculous. You can't just stop participating in our relationship. I'm not stopping participating, Wilson said. I'm starting to participate at the same level you do. The truth of this statement seemed to hit Sarah like cold water. For the first time in the conversation, she looked genuinely frightened. What if I don't know how to do that? Sarah asked quietly. It was the first honest thing she'd said all morning, and Wilson felt a flicker of hope mixed with profound sadness. Sarah was admitting that she didn't know how to actively participate in their relationship, which explained why she'd been content to let Wilson do all the emotional labor. Then we'll find out if you can learn, Wilson said gently, or if you even want to. Sarah sat back down on the couch, her defiance replaced by something that looked like genuine contemplation. And if I can't? If I don't know how to be the kind of girlfriend you want? Wilson sat down as well, leaving space between them but maintaining eye contact. Then we'll both know that we're not right for each other, and we can end this with dignity instead of resentment. You'd really leave me? The question was asked with such vulnerability that Wilson felt his resolve waver for a moment. Sarah looked young and lost, genuinely confused about how they'd arrived at this point. I'd really stop settling for someone who doesn't want me, Wilson said. Whether that means leaving depends on what you decide you want. Sarah wiped her eyes again, and this time the tears looked genuine rather than manipulative. I don't want to lose you. Then don't lose me, Wilson said simply. Choose me, actively, consistently, genuinely choose me. How do I do that? Wilson realized that Sarah's question might be more literal than rhetorical. She might genuinely not understand what active choice looked like in a relationship. She might have been coasting on Wilson's momentum for so long that she'd forgotten how to create her own. Start small, Wilson said. Ask me about my day because you're curious about the answer. Suggest activities because you want to spend time with me. Touch me because you want to touch me, not because you think you should. Sarah nodded, looking like a student taking notes on a subject she'd never studied. And Sarah, Wilson continued, it has to be genuine. I'm not going to accept performances or temporary efforts to get me to back down. Either you actually want to be with me, or we stop pretending that you do. Sarah looked at him for a long moment, and Wilson could see her weighing her options. She could agree to try, knowing that Wilson would be watching for authenticity. She could argue that his expectations were unreasonable. Or she could be honest about whether she had any genuine desire to change their dynamic. Okay, Sarah said finally. I'll try. No, Wilson said gently. Don't try. Either do it or don't do it. But don't try to convince me that effort is the same thing as genuine desire. Sarah's face showed a mixture of frustration and recognition. Wilson was closing off all her usual escape routes, refusing to accept good intentions as a substitute for actual change. This is scary for me, Sarah admitted. I don't know if I know how to be different. Being scared is okay, Wilson said. Being unwilling to figure it out isn't. Sarah nodded slowly, and Wilson could see her processing the fundamental shift that had occurred in their relationship. Wilson was no longer willing to carry the emotional weight of their partnership alone. He was no longer willing to make excuses for her disengagement or accept minimal effort as sufficient. What happens now? Sarah asked. Wilson stood up, looking around the apartment that had become a second home to him. His clothes in her closet, his books on her shelves, his life intertwined with hers in dozens of small ways. Now I go home, Wilson said, and you decide what you actually want. Go home? You mean leave? I mean, I'm going to spend some time in my own space, with my own things, living my own life, Wilson said. And you're going to spend some time figuring out whether you miss me enough to do something about it. Sarah stood up as well, clearly alarmed by this development. For how long? Until one of us has clarity about what we want this to look like, Wilson said. Sarah followed him as he gathered his things, phone charger from the bedside table, jacket from the closet, book from the coffee table. Small items that represented his gradual integration into her life. "Wilson, please don't leave like this," Sarah said. "We can figure this out together." Wilson paused at the door, keys in his hand. "Sarah, we've been figuring it out together for months, and it's gotten us to a place where you're more excited about your ex-boyfriend than your current boyfriend. I think we need to figure some things out separately before we can work on them together." Sarah's eyes filled with tears again, and Wilson felt the familiar urge to comfort her, to reassure her, to make this easier for both of them. But he recognized that urge as part of the pattern that had gotten them into this mess. His need to manage Sarah's emotions had enabled her disengagement by removing any consequences for her behavior. "I love you," Sarah said. "I love you too," Wilson replied. "But love isn't enough if we can't figure out how to enjoy each other's company." Wilson opened the door, stepping into the hallway that smelled like other people's cooking and industrial carpet cleaner. Sarah stood in the doorway, looking small and uncertain. "Call me when you have something to say that isn't an excuse or an explanation. Call me when you know what you actually want." Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face, but she didn't try to argue or negotiate. For the first time in months, she seemed to understand that Wilson was serious about his boundaries. Wilson walked down the hallway, toward the elevator, his footsteps echoing in the narrow space. He didn't look back, not because he didn't care, but because he finally understood that caring about someone didn't require accepting whatever they were willing to give. The elevator doors closed, and Wilson saw his reflection in the polished metal. Tired but resolved, sad but not broken. For the first time in months, he looked like someone who respected himself enough to walk away from something that wasn't working. As the elevator descended, Wilson realized that setting boundaries wasn't about punishing Sarah or forcing her to change. It was about refusing to enable a dynamic that made both of them smaller versions of themselves. He didn't know if Sarah would rise to meet his expectations, or if this conversation had marked the beginning of their end. But for the first time in months, Wilson felt like he was being honest about what he needed, instead of minimizing himself to fit into whatever Sarah was willing to offer. The elevator reached the lobby, and Wilson stepped out into the gray Seattle morning, breathing deeply for the first time in hours. 3 weeks passed before Sarah called. Wilson had expected it to happen sooner, anticipated some kind of dramatic gesture or tearful midnight phone call within the first few days. But his phone remained quiet. And gradually, Wilson began to understand that Sarah's silence was its own form of communication.
He fell into a routine during those weeks that reminded him who he was when he wasn't constantly trying to manage someone else's emotional temperature. Morning runs along the waterfront before work. Dinner with colleagues he'd been neglecting. Weekend projects in his apartment that he'd been putting off because he spent all his free time at Sarah's place. Wilson discovered that he'd forgotten how much he enjoyed his own company. Without the constant low-level anxiety of wondering whether Sarah was happy or engaged or satisfied with their plans, Wilson found himself relaxing into decisions based solely on what he wanted to do. He cleaned out his closet and donated clothes he'd been holding on to for years. He finally hung the artwork he'd bought months ago but never put up because he was never sure how long he'd be staying in his own apartment. He cooked elaborate meals for one and ate them while reading books he'd been meaning to get to. On a Thursday evening, while Wilson was assembling a bookshelf he'd ordered online, his phone rang. Sarah's name appeared on the screen, and Wilson felt his stomach tighten with a mixture of anticipation and dread. "Hello?" Wilson answered, his voice neutral. "Hi," Sarah said, and Wilson could hear uncertainty in her voice. "Can we talk?" "That depends," Wilson replied, setting down his screwdriver. "Are you calling to explain why you've been right all along, or do you actually have something different to say?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, and Wilson could practically hear her recalibrating her approach. "I've been thinking," Sarah said finally, "a lot about what you said, about us, and I think you were right about some things." Wilson waited, refusing to make this easier for her by asking what things or expressing gratitude for her minimal acknowledgement. "I think I did get comfortable," Sarah continued. "I think I stopped trying because I assumed you'd always be there no matter what I did or didn't do." "Okay," Wilson said. "I miss you," Sarah said, her voice smaller now. "I miss having you around. I miss our routines."
Wilson noticed that Sarah missed having him around and missed their routines, but she hadn't said she missed him. The distinction felt significant. "What do you miss about me specifically?" Wilson asked. Sarah paused, clearly not expecting the question to be so direct. "I miss how you always knew what I needed before I asked for it," Sarah said. "I miss how you took care of things so I didn't have to worry about them. I miss knowing that you were handling all the details of our life together." Wilson felt something cold settle in his chest. Sarah missed him the way someone might miss a personal assistant or a household manager. She missed the services he provided, not his actual presence or personality. "That's what you miss about me?" Wilson asked. "The fact that I handled details?" "No, that's not. I mean, I miss other things too." "What things?" Another pause, longer this time. "I miss feeling like someone cared about me that much," Sarah said finally. Wilson recognized this admission as probably the most honest thing Sarah had said about their relationship in months. She missed being cared for, not caring for someone else. She missed being the recipient of attention and effort, not the experience of giving those things. "Sarah," Wilson said gently, "do you miss me, or do you miss being taken care of?" Sarah's silence stretched long enough that Wilson began to wonder if the call had dropped. "I don't know," Sarah said eventually, and Wilson could hear tears in her voice. "I don't know how to tell the difference." For the first time since Sarah had called, Wilson felt a flicker of genuine sympathy for her. Sarah seemed to be recognizing something about herself that was difficult to acknowledge. "That's probably something you should figure out," Wilson said. "I've been trying," Sarah said. "I've been asking myself what I actually want, and I keep coming back to wanting things to go back to how they were before." "Before when?" "Before you got upset about Marcus, before you started making demands, before everything got complicated." Wilson set down his phone and put it on speaker, needing both hands free to continue working on his bookshelf. The familiar motions of assembly gave him something to focus on while processing what Sarah was telling him. "Sarah, things were already complicated," Wilson said, sliding a wooden panel into place. "I just stopped pretending they weren't." "But we were happy," Sarah protested. "You were comfortable," Wilson corrected. "I was miserable." "You never said you were miserable." Wilson paused his work, recognizing this as another deflection. Sarah was suggesting that Wilson's unhappiness was his fault for not communicating it clearly enough. "I said I needed more connection," Wilson replied. "I said I felt like we were living parallel lives. I said I missed feeling like we were excited about each other. You told me I was being needy." "I never said you were needy." Wilson could hear Sarah's voice taking on that edge it got when she felt cornered. The sharpness that meant she was about to start rewriting history to support her version of events. "You're right," Wilson said. "You never used that exact word. You just acted like my requests for basic affection were unreasonable demands." Sarah was quiet again, and Wilson continued working on his bookshelf, finding the rhythmic process soothing. "I don't know how to be the kind of girlfriend you want." "I don't want you to be a kind of girlfriend," Wilson replied. "I want you to be someone who wants to be with me." "I do want to be with you." "No," Wilson said, tightening a screw with more force than necessary. "You want me to want to be with you. You want someone who will prioritize you and take care of you and make you feel special. But you don't actually want to do any of those things for someone else." The words came out harsher than Wilson had intended, but he realized it were accurate. Sarah wanted to be loved, but she didn't want to love someone else with the same intensity. "That's not fair," Sarah said. But her protest sounded automatic rather than genuine. "Maybe not," Wilson agreed. "But it's true." Sarah started crying then, real tears that Wilson could hear through the phone. But instead of feeling the usual compulsion to comfort her, Wilson felt oddly detached from her distress. Her tears no longer felt like an emergency he needed to fix. "So what now?" Sarah asked through her crying. "You're just done with me?" Wilson finished tightening the last screw on his bookshelf and stepped back to admire his work. It was solid, level, and exactly what he'd intended it to be. I'm done trying to convince you to care about me the way I care about you. I'm done accepting scraps of attention and pretending they're enough. I'm done making excuses for someone who treats me like an option instead of a priority. But I love you, Sarah said desperately. I believe you do, Wilson replied, but not enough to change anything. Not enough to prioritize me.
Not enough to choose me consistently instead of just when it's convenient. Sarah's crying intensified, and Wilson could hear her struggling to form words between sobs. "Please don't give up on us," Sarah managed to say. "Please give me another chance." Wilson looked around his apartment, taking in the bookshelf he'd just built, the artwork on the walls, the comfortable space he'd created for himself. For the first time in months, his environment felt like a reflection of who he was, rather than a compromise with someone else's preferences. "Sarah," Wilson said quietly, "I gave you chances for 8 months. I gave you chances when you started pulling away. I gave you chances when you stopped initiating affection. I gave you chances when you made me feel like wanting connection was unreasonable. I gave you a chance after your birthday party when I told you exactly what I needed." Wilson paused, letting his words sink in. "What you're asking for now isn't another chance," Wilson continued. "You're asking me to go back to accepting less than I deserve so you don't have to change anything about yourself." "I'll change," Sarah said quickly. "I'll be more affectionate. I'll plan dates. I'll be more engaged." "You'll perform being more engaged," Wilson corrected, "until the pressure gets to be too much and you go back to treating me like furniture." Sarah's tears had shifted from desperate to angry, and Wilson could hear the change in her breathing. "So you're perfect?" Sarah snapped. "You never did anything wrong in our relationship?" Wilson had been expecting this question, the inevitable attempt to make their relationship problems mutual instead of acknowledging Sarah's specific contributions to their dysfunction. "I'm sure I made mistakes," Wilson said, "but my mistakes were things like being too accommodating, too understanding, too willing to make excuses for your behavior. My mistakes were loving you more than I loved myself." "That's not a mistake," Sarah said, her voice softening again. "Yes, it is," replied, "because it enabled you to stop loving me back." Sarah was quiet for a long time, and Wilson could hear her processing this idea. "I never stopped loving you," Sarah said finally. "You stopped showing it," Wilson replied. "You stopped choosing it. You stopped acting like it mattered to you." "So that's it?" Sarah asked. 3 years together, and you're throwing it all away because I went through a rough patch?" Wilson recognized this framing as Sarah's final attempt to make him the unreasonable one, to position herself as the victim of his unrealistic expectations. 3 years together, and you're not willing to admit that you've been taking me for granted?" Wilson replied. 3 years together, and your solution is to ask me to settle for less so you don't have to give more." "I can give more," Sarah protested. "Then do it with someone else," Wilson said. "Find someone who makes you want to give more without being asked." "You don't mean that." Wilson looked out his window at the street below, watching people walk by with their own purposes and destinations. Each person living their own life, making their own choices, pursuing their own version of happiness. "I do mean it," Wilson said. "I want you to be with someone who makes you feel the way Marcus made you feel at your birthday party. Someone who makes you laugh genuinely, someone you're excited to see, someone you want to touch and talk to and spend time with." "And what about you?" Sarah asked quietly. "I want to be with someone who feels that way about me," Wilson replied. "Someone who chooses me because they can't imagine being with anyone else, not because I've convinced them they should." Sarah was crying again, but quietly now, without the desperate edge from earlier. "I wish I could be that person for you," Sarah said. "I wish you too," Wilson replied. "But wishing isn't enough." They sat in silence for several minutes, both of them acknowledging the finality of what was happening. "I should go," Sarah said eventually. "Yeah," Wilson agreed. "Wilson?" Sarah said, just before hanging up. "Yeah?" "Thank you for trying so hard for so long.
Even if it didn't work out, thank you for caring about me that much. Wilson felt his throat tighten with emotion. Thank you for finally being honest. After Sarah hung up, Wilson sat in his apartment for a long time, processing the conversation and what it meant. He felt sad but not devastated, disappointed but not surprised. The relationship was over, but it had really ended months ago when Sarah started treating his presence as an assumption rather than a gift. Over the following weeks, Wilson settled into single life with an ease that surprised him. He reconnected with friends he'd neglected during the years of trying to manage Sarah's moods and needs. He took up photography again, spending weekends exploring neighborhoods he'd never visited. He started dating casually, discovering that there were women who seemed genuinely pleased to hear from him, who laughed at his jokes without making him feel like he was performing for approval. 6 months later, Wilson ran into Sarah at a coffee shop near her office. She looked good, put together and professional, but there was something different about her energy. She seemed smaller somehow, less vibrant than he remembered. They made polite conversation for a few minutes. Sarah mentioned that she was seeing someone new, a guy from her gym who seemed nice enough. Wilson told her about his photography hobby and the trip to Iceland he was planning. "You look happy," Sarah said, and Wilson could hear genuine surprise in her voice. "I am happy," Wilson replied, realizing as he said it that it was completely true. "I'm glad," Sarah said, and Wilson believed that she meant it. "I'm sorry it took me so long to understand what you were trying to tell me. Understanding it now is what matters," Wilson said. They parted ways cordially, and Wilson walked back to his car feeling grateful for the clarity their relationship had ultimately provided. Sarah had taught him the difference between being loved and being needed, between being chosen and being convenient. Wilson drove home to his apartment, which no longer felt like a bachelor pad, but like the home of someone who knew what he wanted from life. His bookshelf was full of books he was actually reading, his walls decorated with photos he'd taken himself, his space organized around his own preferences and needs. That evening, Wilson had dinner with Elena, a teacher he'd met through a photography group. She asked thoughtful questions about his work, shared stories about her students that made him laugh, and touched his hand while she talked because she seemed to enjoy the connection. Walking Elena to her car afterward, Wilson realized he'd stopped analyzing every interaction for signs of disengagement or disinterest. He'd stopped bracing himself for disappointment or rejection. He'd started expecting to be treated well because he'd learned to treat himself well. Elena kissed him goodbye, a soft, lingering kiss that felt like a promise rather than an obligation. "I had a wonderful time," she said, and Wilson could see in her eyes that she meant it. "So did I," Wilson replied, and meant it just as much. Driving home, Wilson thought about the man he'd been during those final months with Sarah, constantly trying to earn enthusiasm from someone who had none to give. He felt compassion for that version of himself, but no desire to return to him. Wilson had learned that love wasn't supposed to be an endless campaign for someone's attention. Love was supposed to be mutual, renewable, something that grew stronger when both people chose it consistently. He'd also learned that walking away from the wrong relationship wasn't giving up on love. It was making space for the right relationship to find him. Wilson pulled into his parking spot and sat in his car for a moment, feeling grateful for every difficult conversation, every boundary he'd set, every choice he'd made to prioritize his own worth. The pain of ending things with Sarah had been temporary, but the self-respect he'd gained was permanent. Wilson got out of his car and walked toward his building, past the life he'd built for himself, toward whatever came next. He was no longer afraid of being alone because he'd learned the difference between solitude and loneliness. He was no longer willing to accept less than he deserved because he'd discovered that he deserved quite a lot. The lights in his apartment welcomed him home, and Wilson smiled, knowing that tomorrow would bring more opportunities to choose himself, to respect his own needs, and to build something beautiful with someone who was as excited about him as he was about them. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.